Jane, so you have a boyfriend despite mom and dad warning. I'm going to tell mummy and daddy for you. Mummy. Daddy, daddy, Jake said, running to his parents' room. Come back here, you little brat, Jane thundered, carrying a bottle, and ran after Jake. She caught up with him and smashed a bottle on his head. Jake fell to the ground. Blood was gushing out rapidly from his head. Jane froze in fear. She held him up, but there was no sign of life in him. Blood of Jesus. I have killed my brother. Just then, she woke up, looking horrified. Thank God. It was just a dream. She checked the time. It was 1 a.m. in the morning. She knelt down and prayed.
Jane Adiola, the 17-year-old daughter of Pastor Femi and Pastor Mrs. Bc Adiola, had always lived a sheltered life. As the eldest daughter in a respected pastor's family, she was expected to be a role model, not just for her younger brother Jake, but also for the entire congregation. The Adiolas were well known in their church community in Lagos, and their strict Christian values had shaped Jane's upbringing. Jane, you know you're not like other girls, her mother would often say. God has a purpose for you, and you must stay pure and focused on your studies. Don't let anyone lead you astray. Jane nodded dutifully every time, but as she grew older, the weight of her parents' expectations began to feel like a burden. She longed for freedom, for something different. When she transferred to Mainland Comprehensive High School with her best friend Rose Stanley, Jane saw an opportunity to experience life outside the strict bubble she had grown up in. Mainland Comprehensive High was nothing like the all-girls Christian school Jane had previously attended. Boys and girls laughed and played freely, and the rules were much more relaxed. Jane envied how her new classmates seemed to live without restrictions. On her first day, she was overwhelmed by the excitement of her new environment. This school is different, she whispered to Rose during lunch. Rose grinned. Of course it is. You'll love it here, Jane. No one's going to judge you for being the pastor's daughter. Just relax and have fun. But Jane wasn't so sure. Deep down, she felt conflicted. She knew her parents wouldn't approve of some of the things she saw at school, especially the relationships between boys and girls. But she couldn't help but feel a pull toward the freedom her classmates seemed to enjoy. Soon, Jane met Enkay, an SS2 student who was popular and known for his charm. He was tall, with a confident smile that made her heart race. One afternoon after class, Enkay approached Jane and introduced himself. You're the new girl, right? I've seen you around, he said, flashing a smile. My name's Enkay. Jane blushed. Yes, I'm Jane. I just transferred. Well, welcome to Mainland Comprehensive. Let me know if you need anything, he said smoothly, before walking away. Jane felt a flutter in her chest. For the first time, she was drawn to someone, and it was thrilling. It didn't take long for Jane and Enkay to grow close. Enkay began walking Jane home from school, and they often talked about everything school, life, dreams. Jane knew her parents wouldn't approve of her dating anyone, especially not an older boy like Enkay. But the excitement of their secret relationship was intoxicating. You're always so quiet in school, Enkay teased one day as they strolled home. But I like that about you. You're different from the other girls. Jane smiled shyly. I have to be careful. My parents, they wouldn't understand. Who cares about what your parents think? You're almost an adult now, Enkay said, putting an arm around her shoulders. You can make your own choices. That night, Jane lay in bed thinking about Enkay's words. Her parents had raised her to be obedient and God-fearing, but something inside her wanted to explore this new world of freedom and romance. The temptation to break free was growing stronger each day. One Friday evening, Enkay called Jane, his voice full of excitement. Jane, there's a party tomorrow night. A classmate of mine is hosting it, and I want you to come with me. Jane hesitated. I don't know. I can't just leave the house like that. My parents are going to a church retreat, and I have to take care of Jake. Enkay sighed. Come on, Jane. It's just for a few hours. Rose will be there too. You can bring her along, and no one will even notice you're gone. Jane bit her lip, her mind racing. She had never disobeyed her parents like this before, but the idea of sneaking out to a party with Enkay excited her. I'll think about it, she finally said. The next day, Jane's parents prepared to leave for their church retreat. Her mother hugged her before they left, saying, Take care of your brother, Jane, and remember, no visitors apart from Rose. Stay in the house, and don't go anywhere. I will, Mom, Jane promised, guilt already gnawing at her. Once her parents were gone, Rose arrived. Jane quickly told her about the party invitation. I want to go, but Jake, I can't just leave him alone. Rose frowned, thinking for a moment. There's got to be a way. We'll figure something out. As the afternoon wore on, Jane and Rose tried to come up with a plan, but Jake, being a curious 10-year-old, wasn't going to sleep early. He stayed glued to the TV, playing video games and watching cartoons. He's not going to sleep anytime soon, Jane muttered in frustration. There's no way I can leave him like this. Rose tapped her chin thoughtfully. What if we give him something to sleep? You know, like sleeping pills? Jane's eyes widened. I don't have any sleeping pills, and even if I did, that's dangerous. Relax, it's not that serious, Rose said. I'll go get some from the chemist. He'll be out in no time, and we can go to the party. Hesitantly, Jane gave Rose some money to buy the pills. Rose nodded and left, but on her way, she passed by a street vendor selling freshly fried buns. The sweet smell was too tempting to resist, and Rose used the money to buy hot buns instead. When she returned empty-handed, Jane was frustrated. Rose, what am I supposed to do now? Don't worry, Rose said, unbothered. I'll go get the pills from my brother's room. He has some at home. Rose returned a short while later with a small packet of pills. Here, just crush a couple of these and mix them into his drink. He'll be knocked out for hours. Jane hesitated, but the pressure to attend the party was too strong. She crushed the pills and mixed them into Jake's chocolate milkshake. Here you go, Jake, she said sweetly, handing him the glass. You must be thirsty. Jake gulped down the drink without question, but within minutes, he began to complain. Jane, my head hurts. It's really hurting. Just go lie down, Jane said, trying to keep calm. You'll feel better soon. Jake groaned in pain as Jane led him to his room. He lay down on the bed, clutching his head. It hurts, Jane, he repeated, before falling into a restless sleep. Feeling a mixture of guilt and excitement, Jane and Rose left the house and headed to the party. Enkay was waiting for them outside the venue, grinning when he saw Jane. You made it, he said, pulling her into a hug. You're going to have a great time. The music was loud, and the air was filled with the smell of food, drinks, and excitement. Jane tried to enjoy herself, but her mind kept drifting back to Jake. What if something went wrong? What if he woke up and needed her? Rose, sensing Jane's worry, tried to reassure her. Relax, Jane, he's fine. It's just sleeping pills. But deep down, Jane couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After a few hours, Jane insisted on leaving the party early. I need to check on Jake, she told Enkay, who reluctantly agreed to drive them back home. When they arrived at Jane's house, everything was quiet, too quiet. Jane rushed inside, her heart pounding in her chest. She went straight to Jake's room and found him lying still on the bed, his face pale. Jake, Jane whispered, shaking him gently. Jake, wake up. There was no response. Panic surged through her. Jake, she screamed, shaking him harder. Rose entered the room, her face pale with fear. Jane, what's wrong? He's not breathing, Jane sobbed, her hands trembling. Rose, he's not breathing. In a blind panic, Jane called Enkay. Jake's not breathing. I don't know what to do. Enkay arrived quickly, his face grim as he checked Jake's pulse. After a few tense moments, he looked up at Jane with dread in his eyes. These aren't sleeping pills, Jane. What? Jane gasped, her head spinning. Rose, her voice trembling, finally confessed. My brother, he told me they were sleeping pills, but I think they might be something else. I didn't know. Enkay's face darkened. These are hard drugs, Jane. Your brother's taken something dangerous. We need to figure out what to do, and fast. Jane's mind was racing. Her brother was dead. She had killed him. The guilt was overwhelming, but the fear of her parents finding out was even worse. We can't let anyone know about this, Enkay said, his voice cold. If we go to the police, we're all going to jail. They won't believe this was an accident. We can't just leave him here, Rose whispered, her voice shaky. What are we going to do? Enkay's eyes hardened. We have to get rid of the body. We'll dump it somewhere far away, where no one will find it until it's too late. Jane's mind went blank. She couldn't think clearly. Everything felt like a nightmare, but she was too scared to argue. Together, they wrapped Jake's small body in a blanket and carried him out to Enkay's car. As they drove in silence, Jane stared out the window, her thoughts racing. How had everything gone so wrong? How had she, a pastor's daughter, ended up here? They drove out of the city and onto the Lagos-Ibadan expressway. The road was dark and empty, and Jane felt a deep sense of dread as they pulled over to the side of the road. Under the cover of night, they carried Jake's lifeless body to the edge of the road and left him there. Jane couldn't bring herself to look at him as they walked away. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't say a word. Enkay started the car and sped away, leaving the scene behind them. Jane sat in the back seat, numb and hollow. What had she done? It was early in the morning when Jane's parents returned from their church retreat, exhausted but filled with the spiritual fervor that always followed such events. Pastor Femi and Pastor Mrs. Bcos expected to find everything in place. They assumed Jake was asleep in his room, as Jane had assured them everything was fine while they were away. "Jane, where's Jake?" her mother asked, confusion creasing her brow when she noticed his room was empty. Jane's heart sank. She stammered, "I don't know. He was asleep when I checked last night." The house suddenly felt suffocating as her parents rushed through the rooms calling for Jake. When they found the back door ajar, panic set in. Jake was nowhere to be found. They called the police, who arrived quickly and began an investigation. Jane, Rose, and Enkay had already agreed to clear all evidence of their crime. They had wiped away fingerprints, cleaned up the scene, and even disposed of the milkshake cup that had contained the deadly mixture. There was nothing left to connect them to what had happened. The police thoroughly searched the house, questioning Jane and her parents. Jane's lie was shaky, but fear kept her calm enough to stick to her story. She told the investigators that Jake had gone to bed after dinner, and she had no idea how or why the back door had been left open. Days turned into weeks. Despite the police's best efforts, they couldn't find Jake's body or any sign of where he might have gone. They concluded that it must have been a kidnapping. Given the status of Jane's family, well-known pastors in the community, it wasn't a far-fetched theory. Kidnappers often targeted high-profile families for ransom. Pastor Femi and his wife, Bc, held on to hope, praying fervently every day. They believed the kidnappers would eventually contact them with a ransom demand. But days passed, then weeks, and still no one called. There was no note, no demand, no trace of their son. The uncertainty gnawed at their faith, and their frustration grew. Meanwhile, Jane was tormented by guilt. She wanted to confess, to tell her parents and the police the truth about what had happened to Jake. But when she and Rose returned to the spot where they had dumped his body, it was gone. When Jane and Rose went back to the expressway where they had left Jake's body, they were horrified to discover it wasn't there. Panic set in as they searched the area, hoping it had been moved by animals or swept away by the wind. But there was no sign of Jake. "What do we do now?" Rose whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Jane replied, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's like he disappeared into thin air." Enkay joined them, looking just as disturbed. "We can't tell anyone. We have to keep quiet about this. No one can know."
It had been months since Jake's body mysteriously disappeared, and Jane's life had been spiraling out of control. The police had given up on their investigation, assuming it was a kidnapping gone wrong. Jane carried the burden of guilt alone, knowing deep inside that she was responsible for her brother's fate. But worse than the guilt was the crushing silence from Enkay, her boyfriend. Enkay, who had once been her escape from the pain and guilt, had started distancing himself from her. He no longer replied to her texts or answered her calls, and when they crossed paths at school, he acted as though she didn't exist. Jane was heartbroken and confused. She still loved Enkay, even if the secret they shared weighed heavily on her. But the final blow came on a day she never saw coming. Jane, tired of being ignored and pushed away, decided to visit Enkay at his house. Maybe she could get him to talk, to understand why he was pulling away from her. She took a deep breath and knocked on the door, hoping to rekindle their connection. When the door creaked open, she immediately heard laughter from inside. She cautiously stepped in and froze at the sight before her. Enkay and Rose, her best friend, were locked in a kiss on the living room couch. The world around Jane crumbled in that instant. Her breath caught in her throat, and her vision blurred with tears. "Enkay," she whispered, her voice breaking. Enkay pulled away from Rose, startled by Jane's sudden appearance. Rose quickly stood up, looking guilty but didn't say a word. "Jane, I can explain," Enkay stammered, but Jane didn't wait to hear his excuses. But what she did next was so shocking. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. God bless.